I want to click. Democracy is a measure from low to high. We'll talk about what that is, you know, the specifics in a second. Inequality from low to high. It was surprising. You expect those two things to kind of, more democracy means less inequality in general. Why in the world, though, would you have more inequality at, more democracy at high inequality? It was a surprise. It didn't make sense. The dotted line, there's this equation, and it is, you know, for what it's worth, the coefficients are significant. The explanatory power is low, but it's significant, you know, at a reasonably high level. So what's going on? And what might be in development economics, we do pay attention to, you know, how well people are doing, what are incomes like? Is a country doing well or not? Oh, and by the way, that's the United States right there, that red one. So this is more, instead of driven by a hypothesis, it's more exploratory. Okay? Two important basic concepts. Don't want to forget anything. Nobel Prize winning economist Douglas North. Institutions are what cause economic outcomes like growth and inequality. And when I say institutions, it's like rules. In economics, rules are, you know, rules are the Constitution. Rules are what happens when you go to those 5-way stop signs in town, and everybody just works their way through it. It's all formal and informal rules of the game. They determine more than, say, geography or luck, how well a country does. So you've got these development economists. They've split institutions into two kinds. Inclusive political institutions spread out power. Inclusive economic institutions spread out wealth, prosperity. Okay, and that's kind of one version. The other one is these extractive institutions. Extractive ones are designed by one group to take wealth from another group. Slavery would be kind of an example of one of the ultimate extractive institutions. The NCAA, if you're not a fan of the NCAA, you know, athletes don't get paid, coaches get paid really well. You could look at that as an extractive institution if you wanted to start an argument in the bar. Okay? And like the key for our purposes here today is that those don't make for a stable mix. And they're not, you know, inclusive, extractive. The mixture's more like that than that. You know, when that gets nudged either way, it rolls back in the middle, you've got a blend. But what these folks find, Acemoglu and Robinson, is that when you nudge it one way, it goes that way. Extractive institutions are threatened by inclusive ones. So they work to eliminate them. And likewise, the more inclusive a country's institutional arrangements are, the more they weed out these extractive ones. So it goes that way, okay? Over hundreds of years in many, many countries, Acemoglu and Robinson have found that countries that are characterized by inclusive institutional arrangements do way better than the extractive ones. You know, democracies are better than dictatorships. Surprise. So all those spots is about 126, 125 data points, and it's a cross-section. So click, click, cross-section. When I was working in a lab at Penn State, we were doing all kinds of weird things to soil samples. And I was talking with my teacher. I said, well, you know, got to take this to the soil, you know. And he's like, it's not soil anymore. You know, soil has like a secondary structure. It's got living things in it. You know, what we've done after we've taken the soil and smashed it and boiled it and dissolved it and heated it and shaken it for 24 hours at a time, it's lab dirt, okay? All those data points are like lab dirt. They're not, don't think of it as countries anymore. We're looking at democracy as a function of inequality and the other way around. Democracy index, these are all, like, it is used in the literature. It goes from authoritarian 0 up to a 10 for full democracy. And it incorporates a number of different measures, from different sources. And that's a good thing because a study like this can get really complicated if you want to include all the different things that could affect a country's income. Here it gets incorporated. It gets incorporated into one index. Country income is gross national income per capita. And what I did was I took from 2010 to 2017, some of these countries only have data for like 1 or 2 years. And rather than cut those folks out, I just took the average of any data for a given country between those years. So like the United States, we have GNI per capita for every year. So the average of that. For Kazakhstan, might have had only 2 years. I use the average of that. Okay. So inequality is the same way. World Bank is available on the internet, on their website. But a lot of countries, especially the low-income ones, they don't have that data for every year. So if they had any data at all, I just took the average of it, and that was the country's inequality. The idea was to keep this number high. You know, a lot of times you end up working with 5 or 6 countries just based on the data constraint. What's next? The methodology, path analysis. This is cool. It's underused, I think. Was introduced to it back when we were in Madagascar by an ecologist. So it is very much an very much an extension of regression. So just think of multiple regression. I'm not used to being able to look at this. So all the standard assumptions that you associate with multiple regression, randomly distributed errors and no relationships between explanatory variables, all those things, they apply. And we do these path diagrams. They model the causality that the theory tells us. So the data doesn't say which direction those arrows go. Economic theory tells us that. Okay. The coefficients are standardized regression coefficients. So you read them in units of standard deviation instead of like, oh, you know, how many democracy index units would affect 1 unit of income. The beauty of those is that you can compare that one and that one directly. The bigger, the more important. The more explanatory power it has. Okay, I'll show you some examples in a second. We like path analysis because you can look at the direct effect, right, democracy on income, but you can also, based on the way I drew that thing, it says there is an indirect effect of democracy on income via inequality. Regression only gives you these, at least a simple one like that. And when I say low inequality, that's the left, that's these guys. Low inequality, we just, from the minimum there to the left is low inequality, and from there up is high inequality. So that's where we divided the sample. And we're going to compare those two things. The testing hypothesis thing, we'll see in a second. So first cut is just simple correlation coefficients, right? Like how is income related to democracy? The total relationship is like relatively strong, 0.78, and it's significant as heck. It's, you know, good significance, and it's positive. This link between income and inequality, weaker, 0.38, and negative, but still significant. Okay, so that's the first step. And now regression, we're looking at the low inequality part of the whole thing just to, you know, dig into this a little bit, then we'll compare the two. Low inequality, income as a function of democracy and inequality. The coefficients on democracy and inequality are both significant, and this stays negative, this is still positive, and now they're in units of standard deviation. Like, so that's important. This is negative, but also less important, just based on the size of the thing. good explanatory power, 63% of the variability, is captured by those variables. And so we can use them, that 0.748, there it is. That's the path coefficient, democracy on income. 0.112, the inequality on income. And the link between these guys, 0.366. Okay, so that's just putting the data in and hitting the button. And who knows whether or not it bears any resemblance to reality. There's some checks. One of them, that is the total relationship, a measure of the total relation between income and democracy. And we said that the total relationship is that direct one plus that indirect one. Right? That captures the total link between democracy and income. So, in other words, 0.748 times that and that. That portion of inequality, which is explained by democracy, working through it to income. And so when you do that operation, oh, look at that. Nice. So it agrees. It's a very simple check. It's a very simple model, and everything's connected to everything else. So it should agree. But it's, like I said, it doesn't always. This regression's explanatory power, about 63%. And that's the data, and that's our evidence. The structure, well, what's the explanatory power of that path diagram? Does it match the R squared? And get into the textbook and the equation to kind of calculate the explanatory power of that, the direct effect squared, both of them, and then 2 times the chain. So 2 times that, times that, times that. There it is. Look at that. Yeah. 0.63. The evidence is, the regression gives us 0.64, so with relatively good agreement. Yeah. So I didn't make any big dumb mistakes putting this thing together. So that's one we just looked at, right? And on the right is the one that you would get, the one that I got when I did the high inequality. Okay? It checks out, when you do look at the coefficients and, the correlation coefficients and the R squared. So that stuff works. And, we see that this is now too close to 0. So it's not statistically significant. We're not confident in it. We leave it alone. We kind of, oh, well, there's one thing. And also, there's a negative sign, but here it's flipped to positive. Now that doesn't surprise us completely because that U-shaped curve we started off with had that upward sloping side. And that's that right there. But nothing here tells us why. So we're not quite done. Implications for income, well, to the extent that democracy builds income this way, directly, and also this way, negative times a negative is a positive, so it's going to push income up too. We lose that channel here, so that's worrisome. And I mean, if that channel was there and still negative, that would even be worse because democracy is pushing inequality up. So additional democracy would actually lower income. So we need more stuff. Going to add one more variable. Corruption is kind of an anti-democracy, right? It's the opposite. It's an extractive institution, back into our model of inclusive versus extractive. An index put together is used in the literature, corruption perceptions, which is unfortunately kind of a quirk. It's not corruption, it's corruption perceptions. So it's the opposite. In other words, high corruption perceptions index is low corruption. You just have to do a little mental gymnastics when you deal with that, okay? It is used, though, to measure corruption in the literature. Took the average of each country's score for over those same years and added it to our model. And so we're almost done. This is the path analysis, low inequality with corruption in it, and there's the high inequality with corruption. I took out the paths, the channels that weren't significant, just for simplification. And I flipped, corruption is now negatively impacting democracy. Over here, democracy pushes corruption down. So, that's me assigning causality based on this idea here and the fact that the corruption score is significantly different for the low inequality countries than the high. And remember, because it goes the opposite of corruption, the measure itself, this number looks lower, but it's actually worse. So, in other words, high inequality countries are more corrupt than low inequality countries based on the CPI. But their level of democracy is not statistically different. So it's the same. And that's not completely surprising because that U that we saw to begin with, if you took the average of either side, you're going to get about the same. One's going down, one's going up, but the average is going to be roughly the same. And since the last quiz didn't go very well, I won't. This guy here, when we had the model without corruption, it was almost exactly 0.734. Now that we've added corruption, what was it before? Anybody? Yeah, 0.748. So adding corruption seriously decreased that son of a gun, okay? That's the that shift in the path coefficient for that channel there. So we've got higher corruption, and the incomes between these countries are significantly different too. About 15.7 versus 4,100 on average. High inequality, low inequality. But remember, democracy was the same. Higher corruption, roughly equal democracy, significantly lower income. What in the world could be going on? Rory, what could be going on? Okay, never mind. Based on all the reading, what we settled on was those countries on the right-hand side where democracy and inequality increased together, they were actually powerful people setting up institutions that were actually extractive, but they appear to be democratic. If you're an extreme example, a dictator, well, you can grow your country a little bit and therefore steal more, right? And you can do that by introducing some democratic-looking policies. As long as you're safe in your position and that gives you more money to kind of siphon off to yourself, it could look like, they're democratic, but they're actually just boosting inequality and, the wealth of the elites. And so, frankly, measures like the democracy index they should consider that possibility. Maybe they incorporate inequality as a part of their index. Or maybe they try to figure out how to zero in on those policies that are implemented by dictators but are actually just serving themselves. Questions? No. Mm-hmm. It would, and it would also tend to lead to corrupt institutions because, when they're concentrated like that, they're easily captured. The natural resource curse. West Virginia should be very rich. It's got all kinds of coal. Why not? There's some very sad Central African countries that should be extraordinarily rich because they've got, diamonds and rare earth stuff, but they're not. So the institutions that build up around them stifle it. Equatorial Guinea. I don't know if you guys followed. They auctioned off this president's son's cars recently. It was $25 million worth of cars or something like that. Or he had 25 cars. Many of them were worth millions. But he's running one of the poorest countries in the world. But they have oil. So it's all concentrated. And it generates very unfortunate extractive institutions. But, you know, if a guy like that institutes some rule of law things, all of a sudden the country, its index bumps up. But they only serve to make them richer. There was no difference between the level of democratic achievement on the left side and the right side of that curve, right? There, you know, the table like 2 slides ago had no difference, 5 point something on either side. But there is a ceiling, and you know, 3%, just one country on that right side had gotten up above an 8, whereas, you know, 20% of the other countries had gotten above an 8. For what it's worth, that that index now rates the United States as a flawed democracy. You know, we're just ticking down slowly, just 7.8 instead of 8. Interesting. And we're not alone in that respect, but most of the high-income countries are more democratic based on the democracy index. So yeah, you know, this implies that you're not going to grow out of it. You know, you might be stuck there, and then, you know, you need some dramatic revision to policy to get out from under that ceiling. And yeah, like if you're a high democracy inequality, you pay a steep price. Average income of $4,000 instead of $15,000. Nasty. This is, like we said, it's a cross-section, so you really can't talk about specific countries. You know, like that U-shaped path, it's not like if you're a high inequality, high democracy country, you have to sacrifice democracy to, you know, you have to sacrifice democracy in order to reduce inequality. No, we can't talk about it like that. That would require a different kind of study. This just shows democracy and inequality and corruption kind of working together, and we can look at it in that respect. You know, we would have to follow countries across time, and that's a much harder thing to do, frankly. You know, I probably lost about, even though I was willing to take just any data for some of those countries that are low income, high inequality, you know, average even 2 years worth, I still lost a bunch of them. So the low inequality countries, you know, tending to be higher income, they're all represented, but the ones on the upward sloping branch here on the right side, they're not. Lost a bunch of them. You know, we transformed, like instead of using income, we use the log of income, and that helped the regression, you know, meet regression assumptions a lot. But specifically, the error terms were hard to address. And to do a better job, the model, those path diagrams get really complicated quick. And so we kept it simple. The errors were, they seemed reasonable. You know, we've all worked with sets of data where it was a lot worse than these. And so yeah, there's more good stuff to do. Last set of diagrams. You've done very well. Right. We talked about testing hypothesis with this, and what it does is it tests the structure but not the causality. For example, there's the one we started with, right? And we recreated, that's that equation that recreated the R squared, right? So what happens if you say, well, wait a minute, democracy and inequality are not linked? We know they are, but this is just an example. Then, you know, that equation, this longer one, simplifies to just that squared, the total effect squared of that, and the total effect of inequality and income squared. Okay, that will give you an R squared of 0.57, which is quite a bit different from the 0.63. Much worse of a match than the model with that linkage in there. So cool. That's, you know, a handy thing to do, but we're not really interested in that. I would much rather test, you know, the causality. Same numbers, I just flip this arrow. right? And here it was total effect squared plus total effect squared. We can use that. But now let's do a total effect as democracy's direct effect plus the indirect effect. That would be democracy's total effect. And inequality's total effect is what remains after you've taken off that part that was pushed around by democracy. That's that. Democracy's total effect squared. And that's the total effect of inequality squared, you know, the part that's left over after you've accounted for democracy. 0.627. Okay. Flip the arrow, do the same thing, 0.427. So, you know, in my simplistic mind, I see that as evidence that this model is structured, the causality is correct, and that this one isn't. And this is about when Steve starts tiptoeing out of the room, because it's like, oh, here he goes again. And then he goes, you can't do that. But, you know, I think it's kind of interesting. And no, I've never seen path analysis do that, and it's obvious to me. If you can test the structure, why not test the causality too? Just got it. Right now, it's atheoretical. It's my intuition and this kind of very clumsy approach. But it's still nice, and yeah, that's the next paper. Right, Steve? Yeah. Just for completeness, I have many people to thank for this past year. You know, certainly didn't do it on my own. And before I forget, Voodoo Donuts at Site A. 5:30. So questions? Everybody says. What do you say?
Sorry, I missed.
I
missed the beginning, Peter. So is this you just looked at countries, right? You didn't look at localities or anything like that. Do you think this leads to looking at even like small regions like Union County or something like that having these sorts of effects? I'm just curious. I don't know.
Right. You know, a lot of these ideas scale down very well. For example, the Constitution is an institution, and how we approach those five-way stop signs is an institution. Yeah. Now you got to be careful, obviously, but out my first cut, it would be interesting to see. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, certainly when you look at states, West Virginia is a basket case economically, and you know, geographically, it has is rich in resources. Why is it so poor? You know, same thing. So within states, at least, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
This might be too much, but I'm even thinking of things like urban renewal or something like that. Mm-hmm. You know, are institutions like that created to, you know, kind of keep the money where it is?
Right. No, I think it is. You know, it's gonna be an easy fit or a hard fit, depending. You know, and maybe easy and hard is really simple and complicated. But it is. I mean, one of the things we do in development economics is take those big ideas and then scale them down, all the way to a project. Yeah. You know, you're throwing out a bunch of stuff as you go, and you're getting new stuff, but the ideas are the same. You know, this inclusive, extractive, it's driven by incentive. Yeah. Anyways.
Peter, hi. Hey there. Hey, so you extracted data from 2010 to 2017, you said? Can you look at this model on a year-by-year basis to see if it changes within a country? So if that model holds up rather as an average over time on a year-to-year basis?
Mm-hmm. I think I did look at that, because you want to, you know, there's this real desire to get past this idea that you can't predict how a country is going to behave based on this. You know, it gives you an idea about democracy, inequality, corruption, but not, you know, to do that, you have to look at the country over time. And certainly these ones that cover, I mean, the democracy index and the corruption perceptions, they cover more years than just 2010 and 17. And you could. And that would be a follow-on. So now let's, you know, the next look at, like, tries to figure out what's happening to individual countries, a sample of those over time. Are the ones on the left increasing in democracy, or are they decreasing? Are the ones on the right of that curve where it was upward sloping, you know, are they doing something we can talk about? The problem is that on the right side, those are these high inequality countries, they're low income, and they don't have that much information. So all of a sudden, you're looking at 1 or 2 years with data. Real hard to check that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if you had enough time to see if a paradigm shift within a country, you know, when there's a big change in government, if that affects, you know, if that shifts the model, because now you've got these countries with these big swings, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually a bit of a weakness because you can have, these institutions can change quickly in a big way, sometimes. Now the underlying norms of the culture don't necessarily change like that. They can be kind of frustrated. But all of a sudden, so you'll have a huge jump or fall. You know, a dictator gets overthrown, democracy goes way up. So that, you know, where that happened between 2010 and 2017, didn't do a good job of accounting for it. Just took the average. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Especially for some of these countries, smaller countries, that their neighbor gets into a war, or Iraq right now is on the receiving end of a bunch of refugees. Yeah. Ed?
One of the well-known pork senators, Senator Byrd, who brought lots of money, but it really didn't impact the economy.
Yeah, I mean, and the folks, you know, people who subscribe to that, they will relate the level of financial aid, even from Washington, D.C. to a state, and they'll relate that to corruption. In fact, you know, West Virginia's been on the receiving end of a huge amount of federal money for a very long time. 2 possibilities. Either that money is hurting us, or we would be worse off without it. You know, so I mean, that's a question. A lot of people, though, say we're worse off without it. We're worse off with all that money. You know, I imagine Andrew Carnegie, right? That guy, he probably should have paid his people more, but he generated a lot of wealth. You know, I mean, no, you know, all these libraries, like, oh, he was very generous. Like, well, he should have probably paid his people more. But where would we be if Andrew Carnegie, instead of running around doing what he did and building an industry, had, like, gotten a job as a driver with the World Bank that paid 10 times more? That's what happens, yeah. And, you know, the incentives get distorted, the things get messed up. It's very easy to screw up incentives. Oh. Thank you, yeah.
Peter, I wonder if adding some external variables may help the power of your model. I'm thinking specifically of International Monetary Fund structural adjustment programs, i.e. austerity programs, and how those potentially could affect both democracy and inequality within those countries, much less income in terms of the valuation of their currency.
Yeah. As I was digging into those different measures, they'll even, like, all of a sudden the democracy index will correct itself because of some underlying change in policy by the IMF or something like that. And another simple refinement, if this was the process of, say, a hypothesis, as opposed to me seeing something and then just digging in, instead of gross national income per person, it makes a lot of sense to use purchasing power parity, you know, because $1 here is worth a lot different than $1 in, say, Senegal. So accounting for those things would make a lot of sense. Next time around, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Anything else?
I just wonder if, based on your research, if you are able to say that people in high inequality, high democracy countries are voting or supporting policies against their own interest, or is that a reflection of the corruption level, or would you be able to say something about that?
Yeah, you know, part of the democracy index is like participation in the political process. And, you know, you can participate a little bit. One of those countries, the extreme one on the far right, was South Africa. So they vote now, but are the elections as free and as open and as fair as they could or should be? You know, probably not. And they're probably not as open, free, and fair as they are in the high democracy countries. Does that answer your question? What was it again? Again, all of a sudden my mind's going off here. And
Just if we can say, based on your research, if people are acting against their own best interest or supporting policies against their own interest.
They're not. It's more often a case where their choices are very limited. And the powerful or elite, you know, they've kind of made it that way. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to figure out what their interests are. You know, it seems like they're voting against their interests, but then dig in there and you find out they're not. Those are the choices they have.
I wonder if there's an element that has to do with the age of the democracy too.
Yes, dude. You know, that's a longitudinal thing. So this is a cross-section. Longitudinal would follow a country over time. And there's a very good study that said what matters isn't the level of democracy, but how long you were in it. Yeah. You know, because, for example, you could have a country in a given year score very high, but it's their first year. And then, you know, the dark souls in the country take back over and pull them back down. Well, you measure that country, they seem to be very democratic, but it was only there for a year or 2 years. Time in the democracy is a good, important indicator. Yeah. Time to eat some cookies and go to listen to Food or Donuts.
So it sounds like maybe he has a couple minutes if people want to check in and ask other questions. But thank you again. I do want to reiterate, Rhonda has sent out an email. There are a few more spots left. So if you're thinking, hey, this was pretty fun, I would like to give back to my college and do one of these, we would love to see that application. So just submit it in and you can email either one of us and we'll send you the link. There's also the Oregon East Gala tonight at the Pierce Library. Is it 6? 7. I got at least the name right, I hope. All right, well, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you in November.